Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a text effect in Photoshop where the letters look like they're made of folded paper and are peeling up from the page. Let's get started. So first we're going to create our new document and we're going to make this 1920 by 1080 pixels. Next I'm going to come down in the layers palette and create a new solid color fill layer, and I'm going to give it the color 24707E. I don't need the layer mask on my solid color fill layer, so I'm going to right click that and choose delete layer mask. I also don't need this background layer, so I'm going to select that and hit the delete button to delete that as well. Next I'm going to drag from my rulers down to the center of the image until they snap into place, and do the same from the side ruler so I can find the center point of my canvas. If you can't see your rulers, just press Ctrl R to turn them on and off. Next we're going to create some text. So using the text tool, I'm going to create my text and it's just going to say folded. So I'm going to drag that till it snaps into the center of my document and nudge it around using the arrow keys until it's centered, and then I'll press Ctrl semicolon to hide my guides. Next I want to turn these letters into vector shapes, so I'm going to right click that text layer in the layers palette and choose convert to shape. Now I want to create one duplicate for each letter of my word. So there's 6 letters in my word, so I need 6 different layers. So I'm going to press Ctrl J 5 times until I have 6 copies of my word. Then I'm going to click the little eyeball icon in the layers palette to hide all of those layers except one. I'll select that layer, and then over in the toolbar I'm going to choose the path selection tool. Then I'm going to select all the letters except one and delete them from that layer. The idea here is to have one letter in each layer within the layers palette. So I'm going to hide that layer and show the layer just above it. And you want to make sure that you also click and select that layer in the layers palette. Then I'm going to select all the letters that I don't want and delete them from that layer. So you can see if I turn the original layer back on, I now have an F and an O on separate layers. So I'll continue doing this with my other layers until I have one letter on each layer and the full word across all of them. So now you can see if I turn all my layers on that I have the full word and each letter is on its own separate layer. Next I'm going to rename my layers so I know which layer is which letter. So since this layer is an F, I'm just going to give it the name F. And so on and so forth. Next I'm going to make another copy of each of these letters. You'll have to do it one at a time because if you select all of them and try to duplicate it, it will combine all the shapes into a single layer. So first I'll click my F and then press Ctrl J to duplicate that, and then my O and the L, and so on until you have 2 copies of each letter. Next I'm going to double click the bottom letter for each letter pair and change the color to black. So I have 2 F's here. I'm going to double click the bottom thumbnail and change that color to black. So now I have a white F on top of a black F. So I'll go ahead and do that to all the bottom layers of each letter pair. Next I want to convert all of these layers to separate smart objects. There's not really an easy way to do it all at once in Photoshop, so you'll have to right click each layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now that each of my letters is a smart object, I can start to apply some layer styles to make it look more realistic. So before we do that, I want to turn a paper texture I have into a pattern that Photoshop can use within the Layer Styles dialog. So I'll go into my project files and open up my paper texture. Next, all you need to do is come up and click Edit, Define Pattern, and give it a name and hit OK. Then you can close your texture and go back into your original document. Next, I'm going to double click the white F layer in my layers palette to bring up the layer style dialog. First I'll turn on pattern overlay, and in my pattern picker I'm going to find the paper pattern that I just added. Then I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply and set the opacity to 65%. Then I'll change the scale to 50%, and lastly I'm going to uncheck link with layer. Next I'm going to give it a slight bevel and emboss, so I'll turn that on. Then I'm going to change the size all the way to 0 pixels. And under shading I'm going to set the light angle to 135 degrees. And finally I'll set the highlight mode to linear dodge and the shadow mode to linear burn, and then set those to 10% and 25% respectively. Next, I'm going to turn on the satin effect, and using the color black, I want the opacity set to just 5% and the blend mode set to multiply. The angle isn't too important, so I'll just leave that at the default of 19 degrees. Then I'll set the distance to 15 pixels and the size to 25 pixels, and make sure you don't have invert checked down here. Lastly, I'm going to turn on the drop shadow, and I want to set the blend mode to multiply using the color black, and the opacity set at 20%. Then I'll set the distance to 2 and the size to 25 pixels, and that's it for my layer style, so I'll go ahead and hit OK. I want to apply the same layer styles to all of my white letters, so if I hold Alt, I can click and drag from the word Effects from one layer onto another. So I'll just repeat that process until I have the same layer styles applied to all of my white letters. Then I'm going to Alt click on this arrow here, which will minimize all of my layer styles and make my layers palette a little easier to use. So I'm going to come up and select my Move tool, and then I'll select my white F. Next, I'm going to click any of these handles or press Ctrl T to enter free transform mode, and then I'll right click and select Warp. That'll bring up this grid here where I can move some points around and warp my text. So for this letter, I'm going to move the top left corner down and to the right so it looks like it's folding up. Once you move your point, just hit Enter to make the change. Next, I'm going to select the black shadow layer beneath the white F and do the same thing. So I'll enter free transform mode and then select Warp, and this time I'm going to drag that corner up and to the left. I'm going to repeat this process for each of my letters, choosing a different corner to fold up each time. Now that I've warped each of my letters and their shadows, I can start changing their opacity. So I'm going to come over here and Control click all of my black letters in the layers palette, and then I'll set the blend mode to color burn and the fill to just 7%. You can see that it's already looking a lot more three-dimensional. Next, I'm going to select just one of my black letters, so I'm going to choose the F, and then I'm going to come up and choose Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and give it a blur of just 1 pixel. That's going to soften up my shadow just a tiny bit, make it look more realistic. So I want to set the same blur on all of my shadow layers, so again I'm just going to Alt drag the word Smart Filters from my black F onto all the other black letters. So I'll drag it from the F to the O, and so on. Next, I'm going to customize the layer styles for each of my white letters to make them look a little more realistic. So I'm going to select my F and double click that in the layers palette, and I'm going to give it a gradient overlay. So first I'm going to drag the scale from 100% all the way to 10%, and then I'm going to change the blend mode to multiply. Since my letter looks like it's folding up from the top left corner, I want some shading to be coming from the top left and going to the bottom right. So first I'll set the angle of my gradient, and most of these are going to be around 45 or 135 degrees. Then I'll drag it into place on my letter and decrease the opacity to about 15 to 20%. It's a subtle effect, but it's going to make the overall effect look a lot better. Now I want to do the same to all my other letters, but first I'm just going to expand my layer styles for the letter F, and if I Alt drag just from the word gradient overlay, I can copy that gradient to all my other letters and then just tweak the angle and the position from there. So I'm going to hold Alt and click and drag the word gradient overlay onto all my other white letters. Now I can double click my O, and you'll see that the gradient overlay is already applied. To make things easy to see, I'm going to increase the opacity back up to 100, and then I can drag my gradient, rotate it, and position it where I need to. After I've done that, I'm going to decrease the opacity back to about 15 or 20%. Then I'll repeat the process for all my other letters. Now that all my letters and shadows are finished, I'm going to apply a few more effects to make it look more realistic. So I'm going to double click my background layer and apply a few layer styles. First, I'm going to give it a pattern overlay and use that same paper pattern as we did for the letters. This time I'm going to set the blend mode to color burn, the opacity to 15%, and leave the scale set to 100%. Next, I'll give it an inner glow and I want it set to color burn using the color black. Next, I'm going to set the source to center and turn the noise all the way up. Then I'm going to drag the opacity all the way down to about 5%. And that's just going to add a little bit of noise to our background. Lastly, I'm going to come all the way to the top of my layers and add a curves adjustment layer. I'm going to drag the center of that curve down and to the right a bit. And then within the layer mask for that curve, I'm going to paint with a large soft brush using the color black. So I'll paint in the center of that layer mask and you'll see that the curves adjustment layer is going to affect just the corners of my image. And that's it. This is a really unique effect that you can reuse with different text and backgrounds to create a bunch of different looks. I'm John Shaver for Photoshop Video Academy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.